2:28 in the morning, a pacemaker went still. Not because a heart stopped beating. Not because a battery failed. Because whatever was happening to Nancy Guthrie in those final moments outside her own home, in the dark, at the curb, on the night of January 31st, had already been decided. Long before she knew it was coming. The device kept running. It kept logging. Every second of what happened to her is stored inside a machine the size of a matchbox implanted in the chest of an 84-year-old woman who has not been seen since. And the people who are supposed to retrieve that truth? Right now, 104 days later, they are pointing at each other. This is Real Crime Uncovered, and this is our first coverage of this case. Which means whether you have been following the story for months or you are hearing Nancy's name for the first time right now, stay with us. Because by the time this video is done, you will understand not just what happened on the night of January 31st. You will understand why, with blood evidence, with DNA at the most advanced forensic laboratory in the country, with a $1.2 million reward unclaimed for over 100 days, there is still no arrest. Still no named suspect. And still a sheriff who this week used 2 words in a national magazine interview that nobody covering this case expected to hear out loud. We are going to get to those 2 words. But first you need to understand who Nancy is. Because nothing that follows means anything until you do. So let us start where every investigation should start. With the person at the center of it. Nancy Guthrie is 84 years old. She lived, alone in the Catalina foothills. That is the northeastern edge of Tucson, Arizona, where the city gives way to desert hills and winding residential roads and the kind of neighborhood where the houses sit back from the street and the nights are genuinely quiet. The kind of place where an 84-year-old woman living alone does not feel unusual, does not feel unsafe, because it is not supposed to be. She has spent her life building something. A family, a home, a life that by any measure was full and earned and hers. And she has a daughter. You may know her. Most of America does. Savannah Guthrie has been the anchor of NBC's Today show for over a decade. Millions of people wake up to her voice every morning. She is a journalist. She is trained to ask hard questions and not accept incomplete answers. She is someone who understands, professionally, what it means when a story does not add up. And she is someone whose mother has been missing for 104 days. Now I want to be careful here because this is not about celebrity. This is not about the Guthrie name as a news hook. The reason the family connection matters, the reason it is relevant to this investigation specifically, is because of what it means for how this case has been handled and watched and pressured from the outside. When a missing person's family includes someone with a national platform, with journalistic instincts, with the ability to keep a story in the public eye indefinitely, the dynamics of that investigation change. The family is not sitting quietly by the phone. They are watching. They are asking questions. They have the means and the will to make noise when they feel the people responsible for finding their mother are failing her. And as we are going to get into, that noise has been entirely justified. But before we get there, before any of that, you need to understand something about Nancy's health. Because it connects to something that nobody, not the investigators, not the family, not whoever did this, could have fully anticipated. Nancy Guthrie has a cardiac condition. She wears a pacemaker. Now most people hear that word and think of one thing. A device that keeps a heart beating. Keeps the rhythm steady. And yes, it does that. That is its primary job. But a modern pacemaker does something else. It records. It monitors heart rhythm continuously and it logs data. It tracks movement through an accelerometer, the same basic technology that counts your steps on your phone, that registers when you roll over in your sleep, that knows the difference between stillness and motion. The pacemaker logs all of that. Every movement, every acceleration, every moment of stillness. Continuously. Automatically. Without anyone choosing to turn it on. At the time Nancy Guthrie disappeared, her pacemaker was functioning perfectly. I'm going to come back to that device. I am going to come back to it in a way that I think will stop you completely. But right now I just need you to hold on to one idea. That small device, sitting quietly in Nancy Guthrie's chest, was recording everything. There is one more detail about Nancy's health that I need you to have before we move forward. She takes medication daily. Cardiac medication. The kind that is not optional. The kind where missing a dose is not inconvenient. It is dangerous. She takes it every day. Part of the routine of being 84 with a heart condition and a life you are still very much living. On the morning Nancy Guthrie was reported missing, that medication was still on the counter. Exactly where she left it. She never reached for it. Now sit with that for a second. Because that detail, that one small domestic detail of a pill bottle sitting on a kitchen counter, tells you something that no forensic report and no press conference has ever said as plainly as it deserves to be said. Whatever happened to Nancy Guthrie that night happened fast enough, or was forced enough, that she never got to take her medication. She did not pack a bag. She did not make a choice. She did not leave. She was taken. An 84-year-old woman. Alone in her home in the Tucson foothills. Medication on the counter. A pacemaker recording quietly in her chest. And somewhere outside in the dark, something was already being prepared. By the time anyone realized Nancy Guthrie was gone, whoever took her had already been at her property. Planning. The one piece of evidence that proves it is something most criminals never think to account for. Something they do not plan around. Something that was sitting right there in plain sight, or rather, right there at the front door, and yet told investigators something extraordinary about how deliberate this was. The night of January 31st did not begin as a crisis. It ended as one. And the way it ended, the physical record of what happened between darkness and dawn at that house in the Catalina foothills, is where this investigation was born. And where it remains. 104 days later. If you are watching this for the first time and this case is new to you, welcome to Real Crime Uncovered. Hit that subscribe button right now because we are just getting started and what comes next is going to change how you see this entire case. And if you have been following the story from somewhere else, if you have been watching the press conferences, reading the updates, trying to piece together what is actually happening, stay with us. Because we are going to lay this out in a way that connects every thread. So let us walk through that night. Carefully. Because every single detail matters. January 31st, 2024. Whatever happened to Nancy Guthrie did not begin when she was taken. It began before that. Possibly hours before. Because whoever came to her home that night did not arrive unprepared. They arrived ready. At some point before Nancy was taken, someone came to her property. Not to take her. Not yet. To prepare. The doorbell camera at the front of Nancy's home, a standard home security device, the kind millions of Americans have mounted beside their front door, was covered. Not smashed. Not technically bypassed or hacked or shorted out. Covered. Vegetation was pressed against the lens deliberately, by hand, by someone standing at the front of Nancy Guthrie's home in the dark. And simultaneously, and I need you to hold on to that word, simultaneously, the rear floodlights at the property were disabled. 2 points. Front and rear. Addressed at the same time or in deliberate sequence before anything else happened. Now think about what that tells you. A burglar secures a single point of entry and moves fast. And out. No contact. No complications. That is the logic of opportunistic crime. What happened at Nancy Guthrie's home before she was taken looks nothing like that. It looks like someone who had studied this property. Who knew where the camera was. Who knew where the lights were. Who came with a specific plan for both. And here is the question I want you to sit with, and I am not going to answer it yet because the answer comes later and it is going to reframe everything you think you know about that camera. If this was a burglary, why cover a camera to hide a face that a mask would already conceal? Hold that question. We are coming back to it. When investigators arrived at Nancy's home, they found blood. Inside the house. And outside, a trail leading from the house toward the street. Toward the curb. The trail does not scatter. It does not spread in multiple directions the way blood does when something chaotic and unplanned has happened. It moves in one direction. Deliberate. Toward the street. And then it stops. Not gradually. Not thinning out across a wide area as someone stumbled or wandered. It stops. At the exact position where a vehicle would need to be parked for a person to be loaded into it. The blood ends where the car was. And the pattern of that blood, the way it fell, close to the ground, is consistent not with someone walking out of their own home, It is consistent with someone being carried. Nancy Guthrie did not walk to that curb. The pacemaker. Earlier I told you that Nancy's pacemaker records movement, that it logs acceleration and stillness continuously and automatically. I told you to hold on to that. Here's why. At approximately 2:28 in the morning on February 1st, Nancy Guthrie's pacemaker registered its last movement data. The accelerometer went still. Not because her heart stopped. Not because the device failed. But because whatever was happening to her in those moments had reached a point of stillness that the device logged and stored permanently. She was in a vehicle no later than 2:28 a.m., probably moving somewhere between 2:12 and 2:28, based on what that data shows. That is the window. 16 minutes. That is the last confirmed physical record of Nancy Guthrie that exists anywhere in the world. Not a witness account. Not a camera. A device the size of a matchbox implanted in her chest that recorded the moment her world went still. Let that sit for a second. After Nancy was reported missing, ransom notes emerged. And this is where this case takes a turn that stops most people cold when they hear it. Those ransom notes were not sent to the Guthrie family. They were not sent to law enforcement with instructions for how to pay and where to leave the money. They were sent to media outlets. To journalists. Now understand why that matters. A ransom note sent to a family is a negotiation. It is transactional. It says, I have something you want, here is what it costs, here is how we make an exchange. That is the logic of a kidnapping for profit. A ransom note sent to the press is something else entirely. It is a performance. It is a signal. It is, depending on who you believe and what you think the motive actually was, something that does not follow the standard logic of this kind of crime at all. A Bitcoin wallet was included in that ransom demand. As of today, more than 100 days later, that wallet has never been touched. Not one transaction. Not one withdrawal. Not 1 cent moved. Someone went to the trouble of creating a ransom demand, attaching a cryptocurrency wallet, sending it to the press, and then never touched the money, either because they could not, or because the money was never really the point. The Pima County Sheriff's Office responded to Nancy's disappearance. And what followed, in what one investigator would later describe openly as a chaotic first week, set the tone for everything that came after. There were problems in those first days. Decisions made and not made that had consequences. Consequences that are still shaping this investigation at day 104. We are going to get into exactly what those problems were and exactly what they cost. But to understand that, you need to understand who was supposed to be running this case. And who was not. The blood. The covered camera. The pacemaker data. The ransom note sent to journalists instead of family. The Bitcoin wallet that has never moved. Every one of these details was present from the very beginning of this case. And every one of them, read correctly, read together, points toward the same conclusion. This was not random. This was not opportunistic. This was not a burglar who panicked. This was planned. The question that has driven this investigation for 104 days is not what happened. The evidence already tells us what happened. The question, the one that keeps the FBI and the Sheriff's Office and the Guthrie family all locked in the same impossible tension, is who? And that question leads us directly into the investigation itself, and into a conflict that, depending on who you believe, may have cost this case its best chance at an early resolution. 2 agencies, 1 missing woman, and a conflict between them that began on the very first night and has never fully resolved. To understand where this investigation stands right now, you need to understand who is supposed to be running it. And what happened when those 2 answers turned out to be different things. The Pima County Sheriff's Office is the originating agency on this case. That is the technical term for the department with official investigative authority. Sheriff Chris Nanos is the man in charge. His department responded first. His department has stood at every press conference. His department is, on paper, leading this investigation. But paper and reality are 2 different things. The FBI has resources that no county sheriff's department can match. Hundreds of agents, a fixed-wing aircraft, and at Quantico, the most advanced forensic laboratory in the country. The kind of laboratory that handles the most complex DNA analysis in the world. The kind of laboratory that this case desperately needed access to from the very first night. FBI Director Kash Patel said publicly that his agency was ready from night one. Full resources. Hundreds of agents. Everything. He said they were excluded for approximately 4 days. The sheriff says that is not accurate. He says coordination began almost immediately. He says the FBI was with them from the start. Both of them cannot be right. And the record. A Pima County Board of Supervisors that compelled the sheriff to give sworn testimony under oath, a bipartisan group of elected officials calling for his resignation, suggests the truth sits uncomfortably close to Director Patel's account. Now here is why those 4 days matter beyond the politics. Beyond the blame. Beyond who said what to which magazine. The crime scene at Nancy's home was described by investigators as chaotic in its first week. Uncontrolled. People moving through. Access not properly restricted. And in that chaotic window, unknown contributor DNA was collected from inside Nancy's home. That DNA is now the central thread of this entire investigation. Everything depends on it. But because the scene was not properly secured in those earliest hours, any defense attorney in any future trial will stand up on day one and argue that the DNA was not left by the perpetrator. That it was introduced by someone with legitimate access during that uncontrolled first week. That argument, that reasonable doubt, exists because of decisions made in the first 4 days. There is also a financial consequence that the public has not fully processed. Pima County has spent approximately $1 million of county money on this investigation. $1 million on a case that the FBI was ready to fund entirely with federal resources from night one. The cost alone, separate from every forensic argument, is a consequence that the taxpayers of Pima County are carrying right now because of how those first days were handled. And then this week something happened that changed the public picture of this investigation in a way that no press conference has managed in 104 days. Sheriff Chris Nanos sat down with People magazine. And he confirmed something that had been building beneath the surface of this case for months. He is no longer communicating directly with the Guthrie family. The FBI is handling all family communications now. Read that again slowly. The sheriff of Pima County, the man who is technically still the lead investigator on this case, is not talking to the family of the missing person at the center of it. The FBI is. A former investigator with over 4 decades of law enforcement experience was asked about that directly. He said in his entire career it is unusual, his word, unusual, for the originating agency to be removed from family communication. That does not happen in standard investigations. You always maintain contact with the family, boys, because at some point you are going to need them. When a case goes to trial, you need their cooperation. You need their testimony. You need them on your side. And if after 104 days the family's trust has eroded to the point where they will only speak to the FBI, you have created a problem for yourself that goes far beyond the investigation. Savannah Guthrie posted on Mother's Day. 100 days since her mother disappeared. She wrote, "Mother, daughter, sister, we miss you with every breath. We will never stop looking for you. We will never be at peace until we find you." The sheriff acknowledged in that same People magazine interview that the family is frustrated. He said those words out loud to a national publication. He acknowledged their frustration, and then confirmed he is not talking to them. The family has voted with their silence toward him. And the Board of Supervisors, not a fringe voice, the elected oversight of the agency running this case, has voted with a call for his resignation. That is where the institutional picture stands at day 104. But here is what all of that institutional conflict, the 4 disputed days, the $1 million of county money, the family that stopped talking to the sheriff, here is what all of it circles back to. Because if the DNA does not produce a name, if the laboratory work that everything now depends on comes back without an answer, the sheriff used 2 words this week in that People magazine interview that tell you exactly what happens next. 2 words he has never said out loud in this case before. We will get to those words. But first, the evidence itself. What it is. What it means. And what it is going to take to turn it into justice. Let us talk about what this investigation actually has. Not what the press conferences have suggested. Not what the magazine interviews have implied. What the physical evidence, the forensic record of what happened on the night of January 31st, actually tells us. And what it is going to take to turn that record into a name. Unknown contributor DNA was recovered from inside Nancy Guthrie's home. That single sentence is carrying the entire weight of this investigation right now. Everything, every lead, every theory, every remaining hope of a prosecution runs through that DNA sample and what the laboratory at Quantico can produce from it. In mid-April, the sample was sent to two places: Quantico and a specialized forensic genealogy firm. And this week, for the first time using this specific language, Sheriff Nanos said they are getting closer to identifying the contributor. That phrasing matters. Here's why. Investigative genetic genealogy is not a standard DNA test. It does not simply match a sample against a criminal database and return a name. What it does is far more complex and far more powerful. It takes partial DNA matches, second cousins, third cousins, distant relatives who have uploaded their profiles to public genealogy databases, and builds outward from those connections. Family trees constructed from fragmentary biological data. Candidate pools narrowed generation by generation until the field of possibilities collapses down to a manageable number of real people. That process takes time. 60 to 90 days minimum just to establish a credible landscape of who might be connected to that sample. The hair was sent to Quantico in mid-April. 60 to 90 days from mid-April puts the result window somewhere between mid-June and mid-July. We may be weeks away from a name. But, and this counterweight matters as much as the optimism, a name from the lab is not the end of this process. It is the beginning of a corroboration process. Because the crime scene was chaotic in its first week. Uncontrolled. Which means any name the genealogy work produces still has to be placed in context. Still has to be connected to the scene through additional evidence. Still has to survive the challenge that a competent defense attorney will raise the moment that name appears in a courtroom. The DNA is the best lead this investigation has. But a lead is not a conviction. And then the sheriff said something else. Something that landed differently than anything he has said in 104 days of press conferences and public statements. He said, if the labs come back and tell us there is nothing else they can do, then maybe we are looking at a cold case. Cold case. Those two words. From the sheriff himself. In a national magazine. For the first time publicly. That is not a reassurance. That is not confidence dressed up in careful language. That is an honest statement, perhaps the most honest statement Chris Nanos has made since this began, of exactly how much weight is resting on what Quantico produces. Everything is riding on that lab. And he knows it. And now he has said it out loud. Now I need to go back to that doorbell camera. Because something was said this week about that footage that permanently changes how you should understand it. For months the debate around the figure at Nancy's door has focused on one question. Was he trying to hide his face? Was the mask, the covered lens, the vegetation pressed against the camera, was all of that about concealing an identity? A former law enforcement expert with over 4 decades of experience looked at that footage and said something that reframes the entire picture. That figure was not covering the camera to hide his face. A mask already handled that. Head-to-toe coverage already handled that. If hiding his face was the goal, the camera was already irrelevant. He was covering the camera to hide the car. Think about what that means. A vehicle has a make, a model, a year, a color, a partial license plate. Distinctive features that a camera captures and that law enforcement can run through DMV records within 24 hours. A masked face on surveillance footage is a problem for investigators. A vehicle on that same footage is a catastrophic problem. The kind that leads directly to a home address before the sun comes up. Whoever stood at Nancy's door that night understood that. They understood how vehicle identification works in law enforcement. They understood that their face, masked and covered, was not the exposure point. The car was. And they addressed it before they did anything else. That is not someone who stumbled into this crime. That is someone who thought through the investigative process specifically and designed their operation around its single most dangerous vulnerability. The sheriff mentioned this week that investigators are cataloging thousands of videos. Intersection cameras. Ring cameras. Everything captured in the area around the time of Nancy's disappearance. But here is the more precise approach. You already have a window. The pacemaker data puts Nancy in a vehicle between 2:12 and 2:28 a.m. That is your universe. Pull every vehicle moving through the egress corridors around the Catalina foothills during that 16-minute window. The roads south toward Interstate 19. The route toward Nogales. The corridor toward the border. Map what was moving. Eliminate what does not fit. And then cross-reference whatever remains against border crossing records within a plausible time frame from that window. The overlap between those two datasets, vehicles in motion during the egress window and vehicles crossing the border within a reachable time frame, is not speculation. It is logistics. It is physics. And it may already be producing candidates that investigators are not yet ready to discuss publicly. 2 miles from Nancy's home, a pair of gloves were found. Analyzed. And ultimately, a dead end. Never definitively connected to the crime scene. Physical evidence without a confirmed chain of connection is noise. And this case has produced enough noise already. The vehicle. The egress corridors. The border crossing window. Each of these threads, followed correctly, cross-referenced precisely, leads toward the same person. Someone who planned this. Someone who understood what investigators would look for and built their operation around avoiding it. Someone who is either carrying this entirely alone, or not carrying it alone, which raises a question with its own disturbing answer. Because the evidence, when you read it as a complete picture rather than as individual fragments, tells you something very specific about the mind behind this crime. And that profile is one of the most unsettling things about this entire case. So who does this? Who plans at this level? Who covers a camera not for their face but for their car? Who sends a ransom note to journalists and never touches the Bitcoin wallet? Let us build that picture. Start with this. Because it is the question that unlocks everything else. Was this a burglary that went wrong? It sounds reasonable on the surface. Someone breaks in. Nancy is home. Things escalate. A kidnapping happens by accident. That theory has circulated since the beginning, and it sounds plausible until you understand one thing. A burglary and a kidnapping are not just different crimes. They require completely different mindsets, different skill sets, different psychological frameworks operating from the first moment of entry. A burglar does not want contact. Contact is the enemy of a successful burglary. Contact means witnesses. Contact means complications. Contact means everything gets harder and messier and more dangerous. A burglar goes in, takes what they came for, and leaves. No interaction with anyone inside. A kidnapper plans for nothing but contact. Physical control of another person from the moment of entry. Management of that person through resistance and fear, and the logistics of moving a human being who does not want to be moved. Transport. Containment. Everything that happens after you leave the house with someone who is fighting against you. Those two mindsets do not overlap. They do not accidentally merge mid-operation. You cannot walk into a house intending to steal things and walk out having kidnapped an 84-year-old woman unless you came in specifically planning to do exactly that. The camera covered before entry. The rear lights disabled simultaneously. The vehicle positioned outside the camera angle before anything happened. The ransom notes prepared and ready to send. None of that is a burglary that escalated. All of it is a kidnapping that was planned, down to the last detail, by someone who knew exactly what they were doing and exactly what they were leaving with. And that level of planning, that specific combination of operational thinking and psychological preparation, tells you something about who does this. And more importantly, whether they did it alone. We have covered the evidence. We have covered the institutional conflict. We have covered the forensic timeline and the vehicle theory and the DNA that is sitting in a laboratory at Quantico right now waiting to either break this case open or close a door that nobody wants to see closed. Now we need to talk about the question that has been sitting underneath all of it since the very beginning. Is Nancy Guthrie still alive? A former law enforcement investigator with over 4 decades of experience reviewed every piece of publicly available evidence in this case. Every detail we have walked through in this video. The blood. The pacemaker data. the ransom notes, the Bitcoin wallet, the medication on the counter, all of it. And he offered an assessment. He called it a nobody homicide. Not a missing person case. Not a kidnapping for ransom. A crime that in his professional judgment was completed on the night it began. He was careful. He was measured. He was not sensationalizing. But he said it directly and in plain language because in his experience, for decades of it, the evidence does not benefit from softening. Here is his reasoning. Not mine. Nancy is 84 years old with a cardiac condition requiring daily medication. She was taken in the early hours of the morning, the most vulnerable window of any day. The volume of blood found at the scene was significant. Her critical medication was left on the counter untouched. The ransom notes went to journalists rather than family, which does not follow the logic of someone who actually intended to negotiate. And the Bitcoin wallet has never been touched. Not once. In 104 days. Each of those details on its own is explainable. Together, read as a complete picture by someone with the experience to read them, they point in one direction. Now I need to be precise here because precision matters on this specific point. Law enforcement has not declared Nancy Guthrie dead. The Guthrie family has not declared Nancy dead. And Elizabeth Smart, a woman who survived her own abduction against every odd, has said publicly that Nancy could absolutely still be alive. That hope is real. That possibility exists. Both realities can occupy the same space simultaneously. But what the evidence points toward deserves to be said honestly. And one expert with 4 decades of experience was willing to say it honestly. If that assessment is correct, if the investigation has quietly shifted from finding a living person to building a case for prosecution, then several things that have not been fully explained suddenly make sense. It explains why the FBI is now handling all family communication directly. When a case moves toward prosecution, the agency building that case takes point on every sensitive relationship, including the family. It explains why the Board of Supervisors has become so aggressive in its oversight of the sheriff's office. The stakes are not just bureaucratic anymore. They are judicial. Every procedural failure from the first week forward becomes a potential vulnerability in a future courtroom. It explains why the sheriff used the words cold case for the first time in a national interview. He is not just managing public expectations about a missing person. He is managing expectations about whether a prosecution is still possible. And it explains why the DNA at Quantico is no longer one lead among many. It is the lead. The only lead with the weight to carry a case forward. If that DNA produces a name that can be corroborated, a name that survives the crime scene contamination challenge, that connects to a vehicle in the egress window, that appears in border crossing records at the right time, then there is a case. If it does not, the sheriff has already told you what comes next. The pacemaker is still running. Somewhere, in whatever location this ended, in whatever physical reality Nancy Guthrie now occupies, that device is still logging. Still keeping the biological record of every moment since 2:28 a.m. on February 1st. The full truth of what happened to her after that timestamp exists inside a machine smaller than a matchbox. The science working on this case is real. Investigative genetic genealogy has solved cases that had no other viable path forward. C.C. Moore, the forensic genealogist involved in this investigation, does not work quietly and does not fail quietly. The genealogy window is open. The results are coming. 104 days. The DNA is at Quantico. The family has stopped talking to the sheriff. And the one piece of evidence that could break this open, the unknown contributor whose DNA was recovered from Nancy's home, may be weeks away from having a name. What happens when that name arrives will determine everything. There are things we know. And there are things we do not know. And the honest work of covering this case, the work that Nancy Guthrie deserves, requires naming both without pretending the gap between them does not exist. There is a house in the Catalina foothills with medications still on the counter. There is a pacemaker still running. Still logging. Somewhere. There is a family that posted on Mother's Day, 100 days since their mother disappeared, and wrote words that do not require explanation. Mother, daughter, sister, Nan, we miss you with every breath. We will never stop looking for you. We will never be at peace until we find you. And there is a reward. $1,200,000. Sitting unclaimed for 104 days. Either because only one person knows what happened that night. One person carrying this entirely alone, far enough from this community that nobody around them has made the connection yet. Or because whatever happened is simply waiting for a lab result, for a border crossing record, for a genealogy tree that finally narrows to a single name to become something the world gets to know. There are questions in this case that remain open, not because investigators have missed them, but because the answers have not surfaced yet. What is on the sealed 911 call that has never been made public? What did those 4 disputed days, the window where the FBI says it was excluded and the sheriff says it was not, what did that window actually cost this investigation forensically? What is the DNA showing the technicians at Quantico right now, in real time, as the genealogy work moves through its result window? Why does the investigative orbit of this case still seem to circle the people closest to Nancy in the hours before she disappeared, even after the family has been publicly cleared? And the question that sits beneath all the others, is Nancy Guthrie alive? We do not know. And anyone who tells you they know with certainty is not being honest with you. What we do know is this. The FBI has the DNA. The FBI has the family's trust. The FBI has the resources and the forensic infrastructure that this case has needed from the beginning. And whatever the institutional failures of the first 4 days, whatever was lost in that chaotic first week, the investigation is still active. The science is still running. The genealogy window is still open. 104 days of silence from a $1.2 million reward is either the loudest argument for a single offender that exists in this case, or it is the calm before something breaks. If you have any information about the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie, anything at all, no matter how small it seems, the number is 1-800-CLL-FBI. You can be completely anonymous. The reward is real. The investigation is active. And wherever she is, Nancy Guthrie deserves to come home. If this is your first time on this channel, welcome to Real Crime Uncovered. We cover cases like this one with the depth and the honesty they deserve. Hit subscribe so you do not miss our next update on this case, because the DNA result window is open, and when something breaks we will be here to break it down. And if you have been with us from the beginning, thank you. Share this video, because the more people who know Nancy's story, the more eyes are watching. And in cases like this, that matters. Stay with us.